The hatchery truck came up Marguerite Wooten's lane every few weeks for the better part of a year, and every time it came, it left the same way, backing down to the edge of her pond and dumping a tank of fish nobody else wanted. Gone again before she had even finished walking down from the house to see what had come this time. She was 62, a widow, and she had inherited that 11-acre pond, along with the rest of her late husband's place in Lonoke County, Arkansas, a stretch of flat delta ground that had more fish ponds per square mile than almost anywhere else in the country. The man running the hatchery 2 roads over, Roy Paget, had been using her water as a dumping ground since before her husband died, an arrangement Roy had made with the old man over coffee that nobody had ever bothered writing down, a handshake understanding that had simply outlived the man who made it. His hatchery raised fingerlings on contract for the state's big stocking programs and for private catfish farms, and every batch produced fish that did not make the grade, wrong size for the order, a stray species mixed in from a cross-contaminated tank, minor fin damage that no commercial buyer would accept. Roy could not legally dump them in a public waterway, and destroying healthy fish by the thousand bothered him more than he ever said out loud. So for years he had simply trucked the rejects to the Wooten Pond and let them go, and never thought twice about what happened to them after that. Marguerite had always let it happen without much comment. Then her husband died, and the money got tight in the particular way it gets tight for a woman suddenly running a place alone that 2 incomes used to carry. And she started looking at that pond differently, standing at the edge of it some evenings, watching 4 or 5 species of cast-off fish moving through water that, as far as anyone in that county knew, was doing exactly nothing for anybody. Roy Paget found it a little sad, if he thought about it at all, though he rarely did, since a widow's pond full of unsold fish was a small problem in a life full of larger ones. A widow letting a hatchery man's garbage pile up in her water because she did not know what else to do with it. Her neighbors, when they noticed the truck at all, assumed the same thing, that Marguerite Wooten had simply never gotten around to telling Roy to stop, and left it at that. The way people leave alone anything that is not quite their business to fix. 4 years later, a private chef from Little Rock was driving out to that same pond twice a month with a cooler and a check. And Roy Paget himself had started calling her before he called anybody else whenever a batch of culls came off the line. Because the woman everyone had quietly pitied was running the most productive pond in that entire county, and had built out of fish nobody wanted and a ledger nobody had opened in decades, a business worth more than the hatchery dumping them in the first place. If stories about overlooked opportunity, old knowledge rediscovered, and quiet fortunes built where nobody thought to look mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. We would love to know how far this story has traveled. Lonoke County sits in the flat delta country east of Little Rock, ground so suited to holding water that the region has been called, for decades, the aquaculture capital of the country. Thousands of acres of levee ponds, raising catfish and bait fish and sport fish for stocking programs across half the South. The levees themselves, a permanent feature of the landscape, the way fence lines are permanent elsewhere. Almost every one of those operations runs the same way. A single species, raised at high density, in a pond managed entirely around that one animal's needs, fed a formulated ration, harvested on a schedule set by a packing contract. It is efficient, and it scales well, and it is the reason the whole regional industry could grow as large as it did. It is also, in a narrower sense than most people realize, wasteful. Because a pond is not simply a tank of water holding one kind of fish. It is a small, layered food web, plankton near the surface, insects and invertebrates in the mid-water, decaying organic matter and algae along the bottom, and a single species raised alone uses only the slice of that food web suited to its own habits, leaving the rest of the pond's natural productivity sitting there unused every single day of the year. Generation after generation of uneaten food simply settling to the bottom and breaking down. Marguerite did not work that out from a textbook. She worked it out from a ledger. Going through her husband's late father's things in the back of an old equipment shed, sorting through boxes she had been putting off for the better part of a year, because grief has a way of making even simple chores feel unbearable. She found a water-stained composition book that had belonged to her husband's great-uncle, a man named Silas Wooten, who had worked that same pond back in the 1950s and 60s, decades before the family switched over to a single contracted catfish operation the way most of the county eventually did. Silas had kept detailed, almost obsessive notes. Species stocked together, ratios, what he fed and when, and observations in the margins about which combinations of fish seemed to thrive together and which did not, written in a small, cramped hand that she had to hold close to the window light to make out in places. He had been running, without ever using the word for it, a form of polyculture, stocking several species at once so that each one used a different part of the pond and none of them competed directly for the same food. It was, Marguerite later learned from an extension agent who finally took an interest, a method with roots going back more than 2,000 years in Chinese pond farming, refined over centuries, long before anyone in Arkansas ever dug a levee, carried across the world in one form or another, wherever people had kept fish in still water and paid close attention to what those fish actually ate. American aquaculture had largely abandoned it in the 20th century in favor of the simpler, easier to manage, easier to sell single-species model that built the whole regional industry around her. A shift that made perfect business sense for anyone selling into a single commodity market, and none at all for anyone trying to get the most out of one small pond on its own terms. Silas Wooten had known the old method. His own descendants had let it lapse without ever quite deciding to. The way so much practical knowledge gets lost, not through any single decision to abandon it, but through decades of nobody asking the right question at the right moment. Here is the mechanism, and it is the whole reason a widow with no fisheries training out produced operations that had been running for decades on conventional method. A pond stocked with only one species, however well managed, leaves most of its natural food supply completely untouched, because that one species can only eat what its own mouth and habits allow it to eat. Stock several species together, chosen so their feeding habits do not overlap, and the pond starts working the way a healthy natural water body actually works. A bottom-feeding species cleans up settled organic matter and leftover feed that would otherwise just decay and foul the water, converting waste that would otherwise cost the operator in water quality problems into another harvestable pound of fish. A midwater species built for insects and small invertebrates works a layer the bottom feeder never touches, picking off the abundant small life that a single species pond simply lets multiply and die unused. A grazing species keeps aquatic vegetation from choking the pond, which both improves water quality and adds another harvestable animal to the mix, doing a job that a single species operation would otherwise have to pay a contractor or a chemical treatment to handle separately. None of them are competing for the same resource, so the total weight of fish a single acre of water can support and grow to market size, across all the species combined, runs significantly higher than what that same acre could produce, carrying only one kind of fish at the density it could tolerate alone. Roy's culls, it turned out, were close to ideal raw material for exactly that system, because they arrived already mixed, a little of this species and a little of that, off-grade for any single contract, but perfectly usable stock for a pond built to raise several kinds at once rather than sort and match one. What looked, from the hatchery side, like an inconvenient jumble that nobody could sell was, from the pond side, precisely the starting inventory a polyculture system actually wants. Marguerite restocked the pond deliberately for the first time this spring after she found the ledger. working out ratios from Silas Wooten's old notes, and updating them with what the extension agent could tell her about current disease and water quality standards. Translating decades-old handwritten fractions into something she could actually stand at the edge of the pond and act on. She added grass carp for vegetation control and channel catfish for the bottom, and after some hesitation, a small batch of tilapia for the mid-water layer, a species that turned out to require its own separate wrangling with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, since tilapia cannot survive a Delta winter outdoors, and the state treats any warm water species with escape potential as a real regulatory concern, requiring permits, containment plans, and inspection before she was allowed to keep them at all. It took the better part of a year of paperwork, phone calls, and one uncomfortable site visit from a state biologist who clearly expected to find a problem before she had legal standing to run the pond the way Silas once had run it, without anyone asking him a single question about it. She kept detailed records of her own that first year, weighing samples, tracking growth by species, noting die-offs and successes in a fresh notebook set right alongside Silas Wooten's original, an unbroken line of handwriting across 70 years, with a 2-generation gap in the middle, where nobody had bothered to write anything down at all. A silence in the record, just as telling, in its own way, as anything either of them had actually written. The catastrophe came in her second full season, in the worst way a pond operation can fail. A still, humid night in late July. No wind for 3 days running. Water temperatures high enough that the pond had almost no oxygen reserve left to draw on after dark, and every species in that water pulling on the same thin supply of dissolved oxygen at once. The exact kind of night every experienced pond operator in that county dreaded, and most had lost stock to at least once in their careers. She woke before dawn to find fish gasping at the surface across the whole pond, hundreds of them working their mouths at the top of water gone thin and warm overnight, and by the time she and a neighbor got an emergency aerator running off a borrowed generator, she had lost close to a third of her stock, floating along the bank in the gray morning light, days before a scheduled sale to a regional distributor she had spent months lining up and had been counting on to finally make the whole venture pay for itself. She could have gone back to simply letting Roy's trucks dump and forgetting the whole idea, and there were mornings that week when that felt like the only sensible option left to her. She spent that whole day on the phone instead, first with the extension agent, then with Roy himself, who drove out that same afternoon and helped her rebuild her stocking plan around better aeration and lower density. The kind of practical correction that came only from a man who had spent 30 years watching hatchery ponds crash the same way, and had simply never had a reason to share what he knew with a neighbor before. The distributor sale that had been scheduled fell through entirely. Marguerite did not chase another one right away. She let the pond recover for a full season, restocked more conservatively, and started instead with something smaller and closer to home, offering fresh mixed catch directly to a few restaurants in Little Rock, willing to buy whatever the pond was producing that week, rather than one uniform product delivered on a fixed schedule. There was no single dramatic moment after that. No inspector, no buyer, no headline, nothing she could point to afterward and call the turning point. What happened instead was quiet and steady in a way that took her a while to even notice as a pattern at all. The same chef kept driving back out every few weeks, instead of finding a cheaper supplier closer to the city. Then a second chef started calling, because the first one had mentioned her at some industry gathering she never heard the details of. Roy Paget began setting aside his best quality culls for her pond specifically, instead of simply routing whatever was easiest to move off the hatchery grounds, because he had started to understand, watching her operation for 2 years running, that he was no longer doing her a favor by dumping fish on her water. She was doing him one by taking stock that would otherwise be destroyed and turning it into something worth real money to both of them, a fact neither of them ever needed to say out loud for it to be true. It never spread across the county the way some ideas do. The other pond operations around her, established, contracted, running efficiently on the single-species model that had built the whole regional industry, had neither the reason nor the appetite to retool around a more complicated system for a market as small as a handful of Little Rock restaurants, a market that would never move enough volume to interest an operation running hundreds of acres under contract to a major processor. Marguerite Wooten stayed, in that respect, the only polyculture pond for miles in a county built almost entirely on the opposite idea, quietly running the most profitable acre of water in that whole stretch of the Delta, while her neighbors kept doing exactly what they had always done. Their ponds efficient and productive in their own way, and utterly uninterested in what she was proving on the other side of the county road. She is 70 now, and this spring for the first time she sat down at the kitchen table with her granddaughter, who had started asking real questions about the pond, instead of just visiting for the summer the way she had every year before this one, and she put Silas Wooten's old composition book into the girl's hands, water stains and all, the cover soft at the corners from 70 years of handling, and told her that a great many things worth knowing on a place like this only survive if somebody younger is willing to actually pick them up before the gap between one generation and the next gets too wide to cross again. Have you ever found value in something everyone else had already decided was worthless? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from tonight.